Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Dane Menke. I am the Digital Marketing Manager here at REGENESIS and Land Science. Before we get started, I have just a few administrative items to cover. Since we're trying to keep this under an hour, today's presentation will be conducted with the audience audio settings on mute. This will minimize unwanted background noise from the large number of participants joining us today. If the webinar or audio quality degrades, please disconnect and repeat the original login steps to rejoin the webcast. If you have a question, we encourage you to ask it using the question feature located on the webinar panel. We'll collect your questions and do our best to answer them at the end of the presentation. If we don't address your question within the time permitting, we'll make an effort to follow up with you after the webinar. We are recording this webinar, and a link to the recording will be emailed to you once it is available. In order to continue to sponsor events that are of value and worthy of your time, we will be sending out a brief survey following the webinar to get your feedback. Today's presentation will focus on emerging PFAS legal and regulatory strategies. With that, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. We are pleased to have with us today Charlie Denton. Charlie is a partner at Barnes Thornburg LLP, an immediate past chair of the firm's National Environmental Law Department. He focuses his law practice on environmental agency enforcement defense, toxic torts, and brownfields redevelopment. He serves on the board for the Georgia chapter of the Air and Waste Management Association and is a member of the Georgia Brownfield Association and the Environmental Law section of the Georgia Bar. He is also active with the American Bar Association and is admitted to practice before the United States Supreme Court, DC Circuit Court of Appeals, as well as in the Georgia, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin state courts. We're also pleased to have with us today Chad Northington, Southeast District Manager for REGENESIS. Chad is a professional engineer with 20 years of experience in the environmental field in the areas of site investigation, remediation, system engineering and construction, project management, and technical assistance. In his current role at REGENESIS, he works directly with environmental firms and end users to develop successful remedial approaches by offering design, application, and performance review services for in-situ applied groundwater and soil remedial strategies across a broad spectrum of technology classes. All right, that concludes our introduction. So now I will hand things over to Charlie Denton to get us started.
Very good. Thank you for that generous introduction, and appreciate this opportunity to work again with REGENESIS and talk about remediation and challenges that the regulated community faces, especially with the emerging contaminants, PFAS. The overview is, admittedly, there is lots to talk about, even though we call these emerging contaminants. We will hit some highlights during the course of this and look forward to your questions to drill down literally and figuratively into the challenges you all are facing or that are of most interest to you. We put together, and I'll credit my colleague Tammy Helminski, who co-chairs our emerging contaminants practice, for putting together what I like to call the three-legged stool of how to address PFAS issues as they continue to evolve and implicate business issues, technical, regulatory, scientific, legal, and so forth. And you see the arrows on this graphic pointing in all sorts of different directions, which means we need to communicate, we need to rely on other expertise, and we need to ask good questions. I'm not a chemist. But you'll hear PFAS used as a fairly generic descriptor for a group of compounds, man-made chemicals, used for a whole variety of purposes and that are very effective at what they're designed for, whether it be water repellent or fire suppression, etc. And so the two that have gotten the most attention, both from a regulatory standpoint and from a toxicity study standpoint, are PFOS and PFOA. And you'll see those structures here, and they are, as I said, of the perhaps thousands of PFAS compounds, these are the two that have been the most focused upon in the world as we deal with emerging contaminants today. But that's not the whole story. You need to understand long chain versus short chain when we talk about PFAS compounds. Long chain PFAS compounds have largely been phased out of production, especially in the US, and therefore long chain PFAS compounds are not typically used anymore, but they are the compounds that are of greatest concern in the environment, which of course is what we're talking about primarily today in terms of remediation. So short chain alternatives have been used to replace the former long chain PFAS compounds, and they do not hopefully degrade to form long chain PFAS compounds and therefore raise the same issues of toxicity that we're concerned about. The health effects for all the concerns that you all have heard about, and I know there's many of you on this webinar who are dealing with these issues or are worried about these issues. The health effects are, to my view, not very robustly understood. The toxicity assessments, and you see a summary here from EPA of those concerns, are very preliminary in my view. Nevertheless, perception has become reality, as we'll talk about in a little bit. The concerns with the toxicity, like many other contaminants that we all deal with, are based on mobility in the environment, fate and transport, degradation, uptake, and all those other factors that create the opportunity for health risk and toxicity. Which facilities may be affected? If you're on this list, then obviously you should be paying particular attention. But note item 10. This is a constantly evolving list of those business sectors, those types of facilities, those operations and activities that may be impacted by PFAS regulatory aspects and developments. So pay attention, but if you look at this list, this implicates many of us in the regulated community, either directly or indirectly. And also, of course, a lot of these PFAS compounds were used in consumer products, and therefore it affects us not just in our business lives, but in our personal lives potentially as well. Like so many contaminants and remediation considerations, it's about the exposure pathways. And here's a graphic from the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development that explains how PFAS compounds can get into the environment and what happens when they do get into the environment. And you'll see both opportunities for direct discharge, like a wastewater discharge. You'll also see indirect pathways like landfill leachate, and then wastewater treatment sludge that then goes to the landfill and then creates leachate that goes to the wastewater treatment plant. And so there's a circular pattern to some of these potential exposure pathways. You'll also see the opportunities for biosolids to be applied to farm fields that then leach into the ground and then can be taken up by the plants. And so there's a whole variety of pathways that in some ways are similar to other contaminants, but also are a little bit different because of the regulatory and frankly unregulated status of PFAS compounds over the years. The primary focus so far has been on drinking water, and so pay attention to this graphic in terms of how these compounds might get into the subsurface and ultimately into the groundwater. So there's been a lot of what if scenarios with PFAS from a remediation and regulatory standpoint. The primary one has been, What if some PFAS compounds become hazardous substances under CERCLA and therefore trigger federal Superfund liability? I would note that this is already a reality in some states. So we'll talk about that in a minute. The states have been ahead of the federal government in many ways in terms of regulating PFAS compounds. Natural resource damages are a risk whenever you're dealing with contaminants, and PFAS compounds have been the subject of litigation already filed seeking natural resource damages by tribal and state trustees for injuries to natural resources, fish and wildlife from PFAS. RCRA hazardous waste, the claim of imminent and substantial endangerment from discarded products that and wastes that could cause a health risk. Those claims have been filed in various courts. And then the last item here is the EPCRA Form R TRI reporting that we're all familiar with for many other substances that we use in our plants, but that has now been expanded to include certain PFAS compounds. And of course, on the remediation front, we'll hear more from REGENESIS in a few minutes about how to deal with these compounds. Disposal, again, and this goes back to the pathway analysis that I showed a couple minutes ago. Disposal issues and challenges with PFAS compounds. If you are sending waste to landfills or other treatment storage disposal facilities, you may be encountering additional questions and additional requirements for waste characterization screening for PFAS compounds, either based on the nature of your operations or based on laboratory analysis. Similarly, as I said, landfill leachate may contain PFAS compounds, and that may be discharged to surface water as a direct discharge or indirectly to a wastewater treatment plant. And wastewater treatment plants, certainly both in regulating pre-treatment for those of you that discharge from an industrial facility into a publicly owned treatment work, and also the waste generated by the publicly owned treatment work itself. What happens to those sludges? Do they go to a landfill? Are they land applied? And do they contain PFAS compounds? The feasibility of incineration of these PFAS wastes has been discussed, and again is not all that well understood. The new federal law that I'll talk about from the Department of Defense requires some evaluation of the feasibility of incineration, at least by the Department of Defense. But there are some challenges there with the high temperatures that need to be used to destroy these compounds. Again, I talked about food chain implications and the FDA looking at uptake. Environmental diligence. Do you need to include PFAS compounds in your phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments? The answer is it depends. It depends on what state jurisdiction you're in. It depends on the business sector and past uses of that property that are at issue. But for the consultants in the audience, I would say that you need to at least have this discussion with your clients at the time you're developing the scope of an environmental diligence approach. And after our clients have purchased sites of environmental contamination, even as a bona fide prospective purchaser, they need to consider whether they have the potential for PFAS at the site and whether that affects their continuing obligations. Even though they may not have liability for it, they certainly don't want to exacerbate it or expose their workers or occupants to PFAS exposure. So I've already alluded to some of these significant challenges. The toxicity is still very much developing. The concentrations we're dealing with here, parts per trillion. One of my colleagues equates 1 part per trillion with 1 second in about 32,000 years. Very small. And we might be used to parts per million or parts per billion in other contaminants that we work with and address. parts per trillion obviously is very, very low, and it's especially so when you consider the background levels of PFAS compounds can be found just about everywhere at 5 to 10 parts per trillion. Public awareness and concern is growing, and the emotion of fear as to these so-called forever chemicals is far exceeding the scientific logic, if you will, of what the threats might be from these PFAS compounds. As a lawyer, I need to talk to you about potential litigation, right? So toxic tort claims, as listed on this slide, these are claims that have already been filed that are pending in courts around the country. These are actual lawsuits, and to this list we can add punitive damages. With citizen suits, there's civil penalties and attorney's fees that can often be a motivator for plaintiffs' lawyers to file these lawsuits. So this is not hypothetical, this is real. And if you haven't tuned in to the documentary, The Devil We Know, or the Dark Waters movie that's presently in theaters, you should. If you're dialed into this webinar, it means you have some interest in PFAS that's more than just a passing interest. And you need to be aware of what the media is portraying to the public, because those are your employees, those are your neighbors, those are, in some instances, the plaintiffs and jurors who will be evaluating your responsibility for PFAS. And again, the perception of toxicity and these forever chemicals has become reality for the regulated community, but also for elected officials who we have to work with and operate in their communities. There's been, as I mentioned earlier, both federal and state attention to PFAS regulatory issues. At the federal level, I want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, US EPA. Last year, US EPA rolled out its PFAS action plan. And note, if you haven't looked at it, you should, because it identifies many of the programs, the EPA regulatory programs that may be implicated by PFAS compounds. And it really is a very comprehensive approach, multimedia, multi-program, research, regulation, communication, and so forth to evaluate and regulate PFAS compounds. I think because of the broad scope of the EPA PFAS action plan, there's not been as much action as some people would have liked to have seen, but it is being implemented, it is going forward, and yet because things have not been moving as fast as some in the environmental public interest groups, for instance, would like, and depending on which side of the aisle you're on in Congress, some elected officials would like, the federal Congress has gotten involved. Right before Christmas, December 20, and I'm sure you all were tuned into this because this law created the Space Force, an additional branch of our military. And so that was the big news item. But in our world, the big news item was that the federal government now regulates PFAS in some very focused ways. Focuses on AFFF, which is firefighting foam, that airports have been dealing with, Department of Defense facilities have been dealing with, and that has been a significant concern in the PFAS world. The law that was enacted and signed into law in December also added certain PFAS compounds to the EPCRA, Community Right to Know, Toxic Release Inventory reporting. That's your favorite Form R. And so starting January of 2020, so we're already into this world, certain businesses, and those generally regulated by EPCRA, manufacturers and other sectors, need to track their PFAS compounds usage and disposal. There are 5 specific PFAS compounds that are included in this Form R reporting, so you need to drill down and make sure that you're reporting only those that are regulated. But you might consider, if you have other PFAS compounds that you are generating in some way or another, to keep track of those, but not obviously report them because it's not required to be reported. You should consider that. I'm not saying you should absolutely do it. The headlines, to the extent the trade press tuned into this law, and they did in the environmental world, are the items in the second half of this slide that Congress did not include. So again, Congress has not designated PFAS compounds as a CERCLA hazardous substance. Congress has not yet included PFAS compounds as a toxic pollutant regulated under the Clean Water Act. And PFAS air emissions are not regulated under the Clean Air Act yet. However, you'll see some specific items there where there's nibbling around the edges relative to federal program applicability to PFAS compounds. The states have taken the lead on PFAS regulation. Not all states and not uniformly. So examples of where states have passed legislation include the firefighting foam. Training exercises are limited, if not prohibited. Usage of AFFF firefighting foam at airports and military bases is restricted, and there's reporting required in many states. The tricky part here is that AFFF PFAS firefighting foam is very, very effective at putting out jet fuel fires. And if you've got a plane on fire, you want the best thing you can use to put out that fire. But nevertheless, that's been a target of states around the country. Pay attention, depending on what state jurisdiction you're in, even if they've passed a PFAS law, which compounds out of the hundreds, if not thousands, of PFAS compounds that exist are being regulated. They're different. And to compound the confusion, they are regulated at different levels from state to state, and depending on what media you're dealing with. Are you dealing with wastewater discharge? Are you dealing with groundwater? Are you dealing with soil, etc.? And note, some states have adopted criteria that are applicable and control the extent of your cleanup. Others have adopted screening levels. They just say this is a level beyond which you need to conduct more sampling and analysis. Many states have undertaken to survey the regulated community about the presence of PFAS in a whole variety of media and in different industries and in different locales. And sometimes those surveys have been generated by the publicly owned treatment works to their indirect dischargers as part of their pre-treatment programs. Note that information requests are not innocuous, which really means that they're a threat of enforcement. You should treat those information requests, or so-called surveys, very seriously. Be careful in your responses, because that can become an Exhibit A to a notice of violation or complaint. Some of the current topics of state investigation and regulatory assessment that are listed here are types of facilities, are activities, and if you are one of these facilities or if you interact with one of these facilities, and I suggest that most, if not all of you do, a word to the wise is you ought to consider your PFAS implications in those areas, because these are focus points of states around the country. But again, states have taken different approaches here. Some have formed task forces. There's some examples of those here. Some have gone so far as to file lawsuits against PFAS manufacturers. Michigan just did that yesterday against 17 chemical manufacturers, and they're using a private attorney general law group to work on a contingency fee basis. So I'll say that's a bounty hunter approach. So be wary of what's going on in your state and in your industry. Other states are adopting a wait and see approach and hope that EPA establishes some national standards to regulate these compounds consistently. Finally, is there any relief? Is there any hope that you have insurance that could cover this, or that you can get insurance that might manage this risk in the context of a transaction, whether that be a merger, a real estate acquisition, or a sale of a business? And so, first of all, I want to talk about the retrospective part of that, which is comprehensive general liability policies. If we've dealt with those among the people on this webinar, it's probably been a focus on pollution exclusions. And the key part there is whether these PFAS compounds are considered pollutants and whether the property damage, bodily injury, or personal injury was expected or intended. And since these are emerging contaminants, we might not have had any reason or expectation to believe that they would pose those sorts of risks or result in those occurrences. And therefore, those older policies may be triggered. We're involved in some very significant litigation on behalf of a policyholder. We only represent policyholders. And our focus is on the duty to defend, because if you can get the insurers to participate in the defense of these underlying toxic tort lawsuits, for instance, and in the case I'm involved with, there are literally hundreds of plaintiffs who have sued this company, then that's a huge benefit to the policyholder and a significant way to manage your risk from these PFAS compounds. So the takeaway here is preserve your old insurance policies. The second thing is, can you obtain pollution liability coverage or similar current insurance that will cover PFAS risks? And that's a matter of negotiation with your broker and with the few insurers who are writing those policies. But keep that in mind if you're involved in an industrial business acquisition or divestiture to cover that risk of potential PFAS liabilities. A few lessons learned before I turn this over to REGENESIS to talk about the practical remediation options. Use the flip side of the first bullet point is the recommendation, which is to use experienced consultants and lawyers. This is not like an underground storage tank situation. There are significant challenges. They are evolving daily, and you need somebody who is on top of that and who has worked with it and has credible experience. Secondly, consider confidentiality from the outset. If you're looking at the extent to which PFAS compounds might be subject to Form R reporting by your facility, consider that an audit. Do that as a privileged and confidential audit assessing your current operations. Don't overreact if you find PFAS at one of your properties. Follow the most logical approach to remedial investigation and best practices, despite what I can anticipate would be significant public pressure. And finally, in that same vein, don't forget about your need to communicate with your neighbors, your employees, your stockholders, again, with the idea that the emotions are running high with these so-called forever chemicals, and you want to have a comprehensive communication strategy that's part of your risk management in dealing with PFAS contamination and PFAS regulation. So we'll be available for questions, and now turning it over to Chad to talk about remedial alternatives.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. So greetings from Atlanta, everyone. I appreciate you joining us for this webinar today. So we're going to venture into that technical domain now and look at both some of the obstacles and challenges from a technical standpoint, but also what are some of the solutions that we have available to us as we move forward on having to address these compounds. So if we just start with the diverse chemical characteristics of these compounds, it can already seem a little bit technically overwhelming, whether it's the varying chain lengths or varying functional and alkyl groups to polarity. There's all kinds of different chemical characteristics that already make this a very challenging water treatment obstacle. But if we look at some of those non-technical aspects, many of which Charlie hit on, we know that there's this moving regulatory target and it varies by state. And then that long laundry list of different facilities and activities. Where do we even begin? How do we prioritize this? And then, of course, with public awareness kind of outpacing the some of the science, and with dark waters and some of this exposure, it's been very challenging to keep the science moving along at that pace. And what about those sites that have been closed across the country that may have the potential or do have PFAS compounds there? So then we look at a list of technical challenges. As Charlie had also mentioned, there's thousands. I've heard up to over 5,000 potentially. We don't even exactly know yet how many of these are out there. And our toxicological understanding is really lacking. We're really only focused primarily on PFOA and PFAS at the moment. We have a lot of work to do there. And then typically, and what we're seeing in our domain is a lot of commingled contaminants, often chlorinated solvents or petroleum carbons. So we have to deal with a very large basket of contaminants in addition to PFAS typically at these sites. And of course, the properties that made them great for consumer goods have made them kind of a bear to deal with in the natural environment and to clean up. So there's a resistance to conventional treatment, whether that's air sparging or standard chemical oxidation, biodegradation. A lot of these things just aren't available to us in our toolbox. And of course, this parts per trillion criteria is a bit overwhelming as well. So historically, we've been treating the parts per million, parts per billion. Just until recently, we weren't sure if we could analyze the parts per trillion, and here we are having to treat to that level. So these are significant obstacles. However, the good news is we do have some tools available to us and some field demonstrated proven technologies. If we look at the ITRC fact sheet, about PFAS, it does state that the current state of full-scale PFAS treatment in water is limited to absorption using carbon and or mineral media. In other words, activated carbon or anionic exchange resins are proven, often used ex situ in a lead lag type vessel formation. There is potential for using reverse osmosis. Of course, can be a very costly approach for large volumes, as we know, and then even precipitation, flocculation, coagulation offer some potential. There's kind of an honorable mention list there, from polymeric adsorbents to advanced oxidation and reduction processes. These offer potential for future opportunity for cleanup, but they're still more at the lab or pilot study scale. But there's kind of a looming bigger problem out there, and that problem is dinosaurs. So this is the part where I make sure everybody's still with us, and also to let you know that I would suggest that we consider not going back to what I call the Stone Age of remediation. And by that I mean, let's not be looking to pump and treat to solve these problems. And of course, pump and treat is going to have its place. High source mass areas where we need to deal with that. But when we start talking about longer plumes, we really need to look at a different strategy. And we have the ability to apply what we would call passive management of these groundwater plumes. And this is a long-term management strategy, and I want to explain what that looks like and how we can use it as a current tool and how we are using it currently across the country. So as we're starting to delineate some of these plumes, what we're finding is that generally they can be a mile or longer once we really understand the extent. So they're kind of ranging free across these landscapes in the subsurface. And the challenge with that is they're crossing a lot of sensitive receptors. That may be surface water bodies and maybe wells, whether municipal supply or potable water wells are going across residential neighborhoods and property boundaries. So the question that we would ask is, well, can we protect these sensitive areas, these sensitive receptors, with an in-situ barrier? And we can. And if we start talking about environmental risk, this is not a new concept. It's been around for quite some time, attributed to Dr. Frank Lawrence. And essentially, it's the product of hazard times exposure. And in this case, PFAS represents the hazard. And if we're able to eliminate the exposure, then we can eliminate the environmental risk. Of course, we apply this concept, essentially risk-based corrective action, all the time globally. We close out sites with this approach, whether that's gasoline service stations where we may leave some benzene mass, a carcinogen, in the ground if it meets certain conditions. Often with metals such as chromium, we are changing the valent state. We are immobilizing it, but we're not destroying those metals. And then, of course, for other contaminants, PCBs, PCE, similar story. So that is what we're suggesting here. This is not going to be a destructive technology or a degradation technology, at least for now, but we are able to immobilize and manage these contaminants. And the way that we can do that is essentially creating a subsurface carbon filter using injectable colloidal activated carbon. I like this visual. This is a scanning electron microscope image on the scale of about 0 to 20, 0 to 50 microns. On the left, you can see pre-injection of this colloidal activated carbon, that surface is clean, and then after injection, you can see where we've essentially painted what I call painting the remedial landscape. We've created this thin layer that's binding to the individual particles and converting the entire subsurface into a carbon filter that now can manage contaminants through absorption. So there's a lot of good news with activated carbon. We already know it's a proven technology. It's being used in ex-situ approaches as well. And one of the unique properties can be traced back to what we call the Freundlich isotherm. This is what this graph is representing. So essentially, what's the equilibrium concentration in groundwater versus what it is in the adsorb phase for a certain mass of carbon at a particular temperature, the isotherm. And what's unique, you'll see here, is that diving to the left. And what that represents is there's a lot of efficiency as we get down to lower concentrations. So we can, in fact, treat to this parts per trillion range that we're being faced with. And just for comparison's sake, over to the right there, this is showing if we wanted to take these contaminants from 5 parts per million to 5 parts per billion. In the case of PCE, which I doubt anyone would argue is not a good candidate for absorption with activated carbon, it's going to take about 445 milligrams per liter of this dosing to achieve that. For about 2 to 3 times less carbon dosing, we can achieve the same reduction with PFOA and PFAS. So that's really good. These guys love to be absorbed under these particular conditions. So that's good news for addressing these contaminants. And by understanding these individual isotherms, what we're able to do now in the subsurface is engineer the retardation factor. So for a quick refresher for this particular term, what this means is how fast is the contaminant moving relative to the groundwater velocity. So in our value of 1, it's moving at the same speed. In our value of 2, the contaminant's moving about half the speed, et cetera. So if we look at the natural R value for PFOA and PFAS in the environment, it's typically in that 3 to 19 range. You can see a source there for that. However, when we add activated carbon, this colloidal activated carbon, we're able to increase that by several orders of magnitude. You can see here 500 to 5,000 would be a typical range. I'd like to think of that as a factor of how much we're slowing that contaminant down as it moves through the environment. So that's very significant in our ability to manage and control these contaminants. And what it's allowed us to do is develop these fate and transport models. So we can either use a certain dosing to predict longevity, or using a certain longevity, develop a certain dosing to manage these compounds in situ. And some additional things I should point out. So a lot of us are familiar with GAC, or granular activated carbon. This is what we might find at a treatment plant above ground in vessels, or maybe even in our home, treating our drinking water at home. And what you find is there's not actually the same removal efficiencies if you're looking at GAC versus colloidal carbon. And what this graph is pointing out, this was a third-party study done by Challenge and others, who showed that with about a 500 micron particle, about 180 to 500 microns, there's the least amount of efficiency. But as you reduce that particle size, in this case down to 53 microns or less, you see much higher efficiency. And in fact, 2 orders of magnitude higher efficiency with a smaller carbon particle. In the case of the carbon we're talking about here for injection, the colloidal carbon is actually 1 to 2 microns, which would offer up theoretically even additional efficiency because of the smaller particle size. And the reason for this, you can see here as well, is that with the kinetics, we have better kinetics with the smaller particle size. That red line represents that smallest particle size here in the study, and it's showing that we're reaching the equilibrium faster, about within a day, and we're sustaining that while those other carbon sizes are trying to catch up. And this is really connected to the particle size itself and the availability of the absorption sites. And we know that with these particles, we have micro pores and mesopores and macropores, and the exposure and the ability of the contaminant to get to and through those is maximized with a smaller particle size. If you're a visual learner like myself, I like to think of GAC, or the granular activated carbon. Remember, this is 500 microns or so, sometimes larger. That's kind of that Jupiter-sized planet-looking particle there. Imagine blowing that up into an asteroid belt, and here what we have is all these smaller particles, and it's simply just easier to access the surface area and absorption sites on those smaller particles. So that's why we're able to achieve better efficiency with removal and the kinetics of those colloidal carbon particles at 1 to 2 micron. So one of the questions that continues to come up is, as Charlie mentioned, we have different chain lengths, PFO and PFAS being more in the C8 or 8 carbon chain length, but there's a lot of other compounds out there that have smaller chain lengths. We did an internal study with our R&D group. We looked at from C4 to C8 and did a relative study. So you'll see the graph on the left. We have 4 different compounds there. This is a logarithmic scale, so this is 100,000 parts per trillion. And then on the right, you can see the reduction that was achieved at a particular dose. And what we found is basically what you'd expect. The longer chain length is going to come out faster, and then the functional groups also dictate who comes out faster. And then the smallest chain lengths, the PFBS in this case, was the last one in terms of relative absorption. However, what you'll also see is that we went from about 96,000 parts per trillion to 190, which represents about 99.8% resorption. So that is very good and significant for percent removal. And that's not the best we can necessarily do, but this was a relative study to show that, yes, we can manage these shorter length compounds as well. So again, here's some other aspects of, in this case, going from ex situ to in situ treatment. Of course, we all want to know how these things look from a cost standpoint. This is data from a particular study that we did in Canada. It was the first in situ application of plume stop, which is our colloidal activated carbon. And we did this 3 years ago now. It's over 3 years, and that site remains non-detect in the parts per trillion range. And that was a commingled hydrocarbon plume that we were dealing with. So kind of an all-in turnkey cost here was about $72,000 to achieve that. And once that's in the ground, there's no additional maintenance or infrastructure, maybe some additional monitoring over time, of course. If we were to think about doing that with pump and treat, and let's just say we're doing that over a period of 20 years, there's an estimate of how much we might spend in O&M and maintenance cost and such, and your capital cost. Certainly that would be over $1 million in today's dollars. So obviously there's a cost savings here to manage these plumes in a similar fashion, but passively, without having to deal with all the infrastructure and things of that nature. So this represents a significant cost savings and a long-term approach. In the case of this particular project, we do have a third-party journal article that was published and peer-reviewed that demonstrates the longevity that could be achieved. It's significantly more than 20 years is our prediction. Of course, we'll have to wait to see, but we are 3 years in now and seeing that it's below non-detect for these compounds. So we're well on our way to demonstrating that. So I just want to touch on one more thing here. So there's a lot of different strategies when you go into the subsurface about how we apply these reagents. So I want to look at different designs and barrier strategies. Really, these are applicable to a multitude of contaminants, but we'll think of this in terms of PFAS containment and passive plume management. So this first strategy is kind of the most common. It's a single barrier strategy. So if you have a sensitive receptor that you're trying to protect, the idea is to put a single barrier up gradient of that. So what comes out on the down gradient side is clean water, treated water that's moved through the barrier. So this can be done to, again, protect sensitive receptors, whether it's surface water bodies or wells, or just stopping continued migration or mitigating liability for migration of these contaminant plumes. A second strategy may be multiple barriers. So if you say, well, I'd like to approach this in a shorter timeline, well, then we can shorten that timeline by applying multiple barriers. So determining objectives up front is important to understand the remedial objectives and how these things should be placed in the subsurface. So multiple barriers basically are going to shorten that timeline depending on what your groundwater velocity is and your contaminant velocity. And then say you have a source that's well defined, maybe it hasn't migrated very far yet, or you want to try to contain that particular source area. We can surround that source with colloidal activated carbon, sort of to keep it in check. So that's one strategy if maybe it's a newer plume, for example. And then finally, one of my favorites, and I think this has a lot of applicability both in the municipal drinking water world as well as perhaps residential sites, is surrounding essentially a well, whether again it's a municipal or potable water supply for a home, surrounding it and protecting it from a plume that's essentially infiltrating into that area. So again, same sort of math. We're looking at mass flux of these contaminants and how much we can manage and how fast they're moving, and we can dose it accordingly to protect these sensitive receptors. I know in a lot of cases, there are places that are going through litigation currently where it's been required that they go out and install home treatment systems. So you can imagine doing that for hundreds or thousands of sites, and that's often just for one area impacted, and those have to be maintained, sampled, et cetera, changed out, whereas we may be able to go out and just put this donut in essentially and manage it before it even comes out of the ground. So with that, I'd like to hand it back over to Dane for any questions that might be out there, and again, thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you very much, Chad. That does conclude the formal section of our presentation. So at this point, we'd like to shift into the Q&A. Before we do this, just a couple of quick reminders. First, you'll receive a follow-up email with a brief survey. We really appreciate your feedback, so please take a minute to let us know how we did. And also, right after the webinar, you'll receive a link to the recording as soon as it is available. All right, so let's circle back to the questions. We have a lot of questions today. So here's a question for Charlie, and it is, any ideas on how to do TRI reporting in the future? For example, an active ingredient from an SDS.
Well, if you're within the regulated community that's subject to Form R reporting, then you need to be figuring that out yesterday. And the idea is, of course, to evaluate the pounds of regulated PFAS compounds. And again, there's only 5 of them that are subject to this reporting right now, and it's a 100-pound threshold. And so as you're considering that constituent within a raw material, for instance, you need to do the conversion from that percentage, perhaps, of the product into the quantity of that product that you use, and then see if you're above the 100-pound threshold. Hope that's helpful.
All right, thank you very much, Charlie. Chad, here's a question for you, and we're getting this particular question asked numerous times. And it's basically, how long will the carbon, meaning the plume stop, how long will plume stop hold the PFAS compounds in situ, since they will not degrade in situ?
Right, that's a great question. So there's a lot of things that factor into that. Obviously, it's based on the individual compounds, which when we model this, we have to look at kind of the soup of things that are there. This is not a degradation or destructive technology, but we can model it. Typically, we're seeing this being managed for decades. 30 years would be a kind of a standard result that we would see right now in our modeling for managing these compounds passively. I suspect that in those sort of windows, we will find a viable destructive or degradation technology. I will say I've heard whispers and rumors of even biodegradation out there. I've seen things on LinkedIn even. So who knows where we will be in the not distant future, certainly in that timeline for destruction. But the good news is, say we put in a barrier and it's going to manage these compounds for, say, 30 years, and we can model that and dose it accordingly. Say we start to see breakthrough, which would begin with the smaller chain compounds, for example. It's kind of chromatic graphic effect. It's not an immediate release of everything. Obviously, absorption it's not a permanent process, so these things will kind of work through the barrier. But what we can simply do is put another, say, 20-foot barrier on the backside of that, and let's go another 30 years while we work through this problem. So I think that we can really handle this with this particular solution for a long time. Hope that answers that question.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Chad. So Charlie, here's a question for you. It is, could you please elaborate on the PFAS sources at bulk storage and refinery sites?
Well, one of those sources anecdotally is the firefighting foam. So they have fire suppression systems because of the flammability of those materials, and they need to protect the raw material and the product. They have fire protection systems that include AFFF sometimes, and as I said earlier, that contains certain PFAS compounds. So that's a source, that's a concern.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that example. Okay. So Chad, here's another question for you. It is, how do you most effectively inject or install plume stop and confirm adequate distribution in the high flux regions?
Yes, another great question. So our preferred application approach would be direct push technology. So if we have the ability to use DPT, that gives us the most control over vertical distribution and accounting for variations and heterogeneity in the subsurface. And then we can, swap out different tooling to account for changes in that dynamic. If we're not able to use direct push, or maybe we have to go so deep that we would have refusal depth, then we would transition to injection wells, permanently installed injection wells. So that would be one how we would apply. In terms of confirming distribution, so one of the great aspects of using a colloidal activated carbon is it's also a great tracer. So what we'll find is that we're able to do pre and post injection cores. We can visually see what's going on both in the soil as well as the groundwater matrix, and even look at the dosing that we're achieving and how far out, say, the radius of influence is from the injection point. We can do that dynamically in the field while we're applying and actually make adjustments real time to make sure we're getting the distribution that we want and anticipated. So we have the ability kind of on the fly to even make those adjustments. But we'll also see distribution that may show up in, say, a monitoring well. That's a good thing. When you're injecting outside the monitoring well, you want to see influence in that zone. And that gives us also an indication of influence where we need it. And that material, eventually, it's a natural organic polymer that's going to degrade, so it won't remain in that form. For example, in the well, it will bind permanently to the aquifer matrix and become a part of the subsurface matrix, essentially a biomatrix, colloidal biomatrix, as we like to say.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Chad. So Charlie, here's another question for you. And the question is, in relation to the incineration of PFAS compounds, has the Department of Defense stopped incinerating wastes, or do they only require analysis of the waste prior to incineration?
I don't know for sure. What I do know is that incineration has been used or attempted with PFAS compounds for the few years that we've really been focused on these as contaminants of concern. And the difficulty, as I understand it, is that high temperatures necessary to destroy the compounds generate off-gassing of, I think it's chlorine, that can effectively destroy the incinerator itself. And so that's the concern. At the thermal destruction temperatures necessary, the incinerator, and this is generally speaking, can't handle it. And so you don't achieve your goal of destroying the PFAS compounds or reducing them to something that's believed to be innocuous by a typical incinerator. And that's why the National Defense Authorization Act required some further study of that. Again, only applicable to Department of Defense, but as we know, especially in this area, military specifications become the standard as for firefighting foam. So that study that's required by this new law will, I think, shed some better light on the feasibility of that as a destructive technology.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Charlie. Chad, here's another question for you. And the question is, what is the physics behind having the carbon stick to the soil particles rather than just flowing down gradient along with the groundwater?
Yeah, so the carbon does naturally want to stick to the soil type, whatever that may be, because there's electrostatic reactions occurring there essentially. And there's a great FAQ out there that kind of goes into a lot of detail about those sort of reactions that are occurring. But again, we actually had to sort of neutralize that attraction by using that polymer chemistry to allow plume stop to distribute, but not indefinitely, while not compromising the absorption capacity. That was the challenging part in creating, one of the challenging parts in creating that particular technology. So there is an interactive electrostatic force that's occurring there between the surface layer of the soil types as well as the charges on the carbon.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Chad. So we do have a lot of questions. If we run out of time before we get to your question, we're going to make an effort to follow up with you after the webinar. But we still do have a few minutes, so let's keep going with our questions. Charlie, here's another question for you, and it is, are there regulatory accepted background concentrations?
No. And the reason for that, and the regulators are repulsed by that formulation or just the nomenclature, because these are not naturally occurring. So typically when we talk about background concentrations, we're talking about naturally occurring metals, for instance. So these are man-made compounds. But the real answer to the question is that you find, whenever you look, wherever you look, you find anywhere from 2 to 10 parts per trillion of various PFAS compounds in humans, in the environment, and a variety of other receptors, I'll call it. And so you have to be very careful when you're working in the field to sample for PFAS compounds, because it could be in your decontamination water, it could be in the clothing that your field technicians are wearing, could be in cosmetics, sun lotion, it could be on the clipboard that's waterproof, etc. So the answer is not background, but that you find these PFAS compounds at levels, and as I said, approaching 10 parts per trillion just about everywhere you look. And because of the extent of their usage in consumer and other products for many, many years.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlie. So Chad, here's another question for you, and it is, are multiple injections of plume stop required over time?
So generally they're not anticipated, depending again on what the remedial objectives are. So again, if someone comes to us and says, well, we want this to last for 20 years, then we're going to dose it accordingly. If the desire is an indefinite sort of approach, we have to look at how much mass is coming into this barrier, and what dose of carbon do we need to manage that long term. So we may be able to put in enough initially to manage all the contaminant mass that we would envision moving and fluxing into that barrier. However, as I alluded to earlier, we could also know that within a certain time frame, we are either going to re-inject or put in another barrier, generally just down gradient, where we have the clean water flush coming through, and keep capturing what's desorbing from that other barrier, which is really kind of a different math question, but it's still something that could be taken into consideration in terms of how long, how much, and cost for these sort of approaches.
All right, thanks, Chad. Charlie, here's another question for you. It is with respect to EPCRA. Since long-chain PFAS have been phased out, which PFAS would be included in the TRI Form R requirements?
Yeah, exactly, and that's a really good question, because the questioner is right. These longer chain PFAS compounds have been phased out, so you're not likely to generate those. The Form R reporting applies, as I said, to 5 PFAS compounds: PFOA, PFOS, which is what the questioner gathered, Gen X, PFNA, and PFHXS. And so again, those are the only 5 that are required to be reported starting in January of this year, so a couple weeks ago, and the reporting, of course, would be due July of 2021, along with your other Form R releases.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe time for one more question. Chad, here's a question for you. It's, are there any significant challenges in the delivery of plume stop to achieve good coverage?
Not in our experience. I mean, obviously geology varies and we account for that. You know, it's going to be different pressures and flows and what we can achieve in ROI. So we can account for all of those. There's really no geological environment that prevents us from injecting plume stop, whether it's from sands to bedrock. So from a technical standpoint, I don't anticipate any challenges in delivering it. We're doing it now, and I would say no.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Charlie and Chad. That's going to be the end of our chat questions. If we didn't get to your question, someone will make an effort to follow up with you. If you'd like more information about law services from Barnes Thornburg, please visit btlaw.com. If you would like more information about remediation solutions from REGENESIS, please visit regenesis.com. Thanks again very much to Charlie Denton and Chad Northington, and thanks to everyone who could join us. Have a great day.